Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Danforth Art Museum. My name is Catherine Tucko-Gerard, and I'm the Learning and Engagement Manager at the Danforth. Essentially, my role is a museum educator, and I'm really pleased to have our program start today. I want to share a little story with you to give you an idea of where the idea for this program came from. In early fall of 2024, I was actually vacationing with my dad in Budapest, Hungary, and we were staying at a hotel that's about a block away from the Danube, which is a river that runs right in the middle of the city. And toward the end of our stay, I began to witness the effects of Storm Boris, which dropped a month's worth of rain in 24 hours over the European continent. That rainfall brought devastating flooding to many communities and affected countries including Spain, Austria, the Czech Republic, Croatia, Germany, Hungary, Italy, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia. In Budapest, the Danube did flood the riverfront roads on the Buda and the Pest side of the city, as well as parts of Margaret Island, which is right in the middle of the river, and communities further south of the city. Soon after I returned to the US, DM Witman's exhibition was being installed in our galleries. Her exhibition is a collection of work that really prompted me to reflect on my recent experiences in Europe with the floods, and really brought me to ask the question, what can I do about climate distress? I realized that I'm not alone in wondering about climate crisis. I know that all of you are having that same concern. So I decided to reach out to a network of experts up at Framingham State University. Professor Vandana Singh is one of those people that I consulted with, as well as various local advocacy groups that are going to be here this evening and will be available to talk to down in the museum after our panel discussion, as well as friends. One of those friends happens to be my counterpart over at the Native Plant Trust, Garden in the Woods, Giffen Maupin. And she and I got together and talked about this idea that I had for a program inspired by DM's work. So tonight is kind of a realization of those conversations. We brought together our organizational mission to address the questions that impact all of us. And we hope that tonight's program will foster connection, community, and tangible ways that we can all answer the questions that we have and act in the face of the challenges that we face with the climate. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to just read off Framingham State University's land acknowledgement, because the Danforth Art Museum is a cultural center, part of the university's campus. We would like to acknowledge that the land we live, work, learn, and commune on is the original homelands of the Nipmuc tribal nations. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse indigenous peoples still connected to this land on which we gather. So today we actually have 4 panelists. Our first speaker is going to be DM Witman, the artist of the exhibition that is in the museum, Ecologies of Restoration. She's actually coming in remote. She's teaching down in Texas, and she will join our conversation. DM Witman is a transdisciplinary artist navigating the climate crisis, employing photographic materials, video, and installation. Her practice investigates climate disruption at the intersection of presence, absence, resiliency, and ecology, relying on both archival impulses and ephemerality. Her creative practice is an act of bearing witness, memorial, and synthesizing that which is existentially urgent, at once both a lament for what has been lost and a call to action to cultivate care and resilience as stewards for what remains. At the conclusion of her program, please be sure to visit her exhibition, Ecologies of Restoration, that's downstairs in the museum. Another one of our speakers is Professor Vandana Singh. She's a professor of physics and environment at the Department of Environment, Society, and Sustainability at Framingham State University. She's currently working on an interdisciplinary understanding of climate change pedagogy at the intersection of science, society, and justice. She leads the education working group of My Climate Risk, a lighthouse activity of the World Climate Research Program that seeks to make climate science information meaningful and actionable for local communities around the world. She has a book out this year that's called Teaching Climate Change, Science, Stories, Justice. She's also an Indian science fiction writer. We also have Kaela Keyes with us today. She comes to us from Surfrider Foundation as the volunteer coordinator for the Massachusetts chapter. She's an ex-advertising industry professional, and she's embarked on a creative sabbatical. As of August of 2023, she has traveled to Costa Rica, Peru, and is heading to Africa next month for a 6-week volunteer program in Zanzibar, protecting sea turtle habitats. I'm now going to turn it over to Giffen. She's going to talk about the Native Plant Trust as well and introduce our fourth speaker, who's Uli Lorimer.
Hi, everyone. It's so lovely to see all the faces in this room and over Zoom tonight. On behalf of the whole Native Plant Trust community, many of whose members are in this room tonight and also on Zoom, welcome to this evening's program. I'm Giffen Moffin, and I have the good fortune of serving as Native Plant Trust's public program manager. For folks who are new to our work, we're a plant conservation organization now in our 125th year, and our community is leading the movement to conserve native plants in the wild and use them in designed spaces of all sizes. We do this to increase the beauty and resiliency of New England and the planet. Hearing this may well prompt questions. One, what do we mean when we describe plants as native, or to use other framing, ecotypic, ecologically beneficial, etc.? And two, how do the combined efforts of individuals like us to conserve ecotypic plants and incorporate them into our communities and homes impact our climate? I'm so glad that my wonderful colleague, Native Plant Trust's Director of Horticulture, Boston Globe's Ask a Gardener columnist, and self-proclaimed plant nerd, Uli Lorimer, is here to shed light on those questions. If you'd like to learn more about ways to get involved in our efforts, I hope that you'll visit our table during the second half of tonight's program. Welcome again, and we're so looking forward to first hearing from DM Witman.
I'm really excited to be here, and I just want to say thank you to the Danforth, to Catherine, and to everybody who's here and with us in this moment. It's really wonderful to be with a group of people who are interested in these things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I came to the work in the exhibition downstairs. So I teach photography and interdisciplinary art. I'm currently at the University of Texas, down on the border in the Rio Grande Valley. Prior to that, I was at a small liberal arts college in Unity, Maine. And I'm just going to start playing here and see, there we go. But prior to that, I was a field environmental scientist. And so I would go out to sites in the mid-Atlantic, a little bit of New England, and I would conduct baseline studies or surveys for threatened, endangered, rare species, primarily plants. And so I would get to go to places like this. And as I was also working as a scientist, I was very much interested in and working on developing myself as an artist. When I was in undergrad, I wanted to marry the two things. And at that time, that wasn't something that was really possible at most institutions. So I graduated with my degree. I worked in the field, and I also tried to develop a sense of being an artist. So I would go to those locations and do whatever work was required, and then I would come back and make photographs like this, using a simple pinhole box and a piece of film. And that became more than a decades-long investigation that I really consider sort of more of a spiritual ecology, about a relationship between myself and the natural world. And as I was working as a field scientist, so many of the sites that I would go to, I knew were going to be impacted, right? They were going to be, a bridge was going to be repaired or replaced, a new highway or an airport being extended. And over time, that just sort of had what I would say is like a deficit. Doing that for more than 10 years, I think it did have an impact on me. And it has permeated in my work. I didn't know what to call it at that time. But then, I was able to, I went to grad school, I got my MFA, and I left my career as a scientist, not all the skills and tools that I had, but certainly the vocation. And I moved to Maine, where I had met my husband. And in 2014, this article appeared in the New York Times. And immediately all these thoughts and sort of ideas were circling around. And I was thinking about the weather and how connected to that sort of, to the weather that I am. And I was thinking about building a snowman with my dad, right, in the dirty city snow, because when I was young, I grew up in a city. And some ideas came across to me. I contacted the researcher. He gave me all his data. His data was basically purporting that in as little as 10 years, the locations where the Winter Olympics had been held, those historic locations, would no longer be snowy enough or cold enough for those events. And here we are, a little more than 10 years later, and that, we find that to be true. So I had some ideas immediately, took to my sketchbook, my notebooks, and started investigating this idea of this kind of change. So the researcher gave me his data, and I visited each of those locations via the wonderful Google Earth, which at the time was a subscription. It's now completely free. And I had this idea to use the earliest sort of means of working with photographic images, which is a salted paper process developed around in the mid 1830s. It's where you coat a piece of paper with silver nitrate, you put a negative over top, you expose it to UV light, and you have an image. And so in visiting all those places, I was able to create, these photographs as salted paper. And I chose that particular process because I knew that if I didn't chemically fix it, that what would result is the image above, something that was red, and it was ephemeral, right? So the bottom image below has been fixed in gold. It's archival, be around longer than I am. But if not fixed, it will disappear when it's exposed to light. And that element of ephemerality was really important to me in the process. And so just so you can see, it's sort of in a exhibition, I was able to combine those disappearing landscapes with those that might remain, sort of giving some hope to this idea of climate change. I had a public participation component where I received a kindling grant from a regranter for the Warhol Foundation, and I printed 250 postcards in that process, and I mailed them out to the public. Most people I didn't know, a few people I knew, and I was hoping to really engage in conversations. I was really interested in having a dialogue. And so you can see here is one of those landscapes up top that is fixed in gold, one that is just made in the middle that's red, and then as it begins to fade, the bottom image. And I really was interested in not having the conversation as climate change or real or not, because at the time, there was still a lot of that conversation. My interest was really in, you see these things changing in front of you, don't you? Right? You can't deny that they're shifting. So they were mailed out, and that sort of began my interest in community engagement. But that project, why I'm spending so much time on it, is because that's what made me feel sort of like I hit the wall. I was stuck, and I didn't know it for quite some time. But as I started thinking about things, having a few conversations, reading here and there, I came across this word called solastalgia, which to me was a new word, but it hit on the very thing that I was experiencing. And another word we might call it is now, we have other language for it: eco distress, eco grief, eco anxiety. This idea of something being missed and being lost, gone. And so as a way for me to sort of kick myself in the butt, and how can I work through this? I went back to sort of my science, the skills, looking for threatened and endangered plants, identifying things by sight. And so there was a little patch of marsh along my studio in Maine, and where I was living and working. And I decided that I was going to collect one of each species and identify it, which was a feat because it had been 10 years since I had really, those skills, I knew they were there, but they needed some dusting off for sure. And so there was a way for me to create sort of these memorials. These are photograms, which are a one-to-one representation of each of the species that I found and identified to species. And they were made to mirror or mimic the herbarium specimens, which was part of my research as a scientist. And so just so you can see here, it's a large piece of paper, roughly, 26 by 20, made photographic through various paints, and then a species laid across. I just want to reiterate that none of these species are endangered or threatened or noted, and they were all common at this point. And so I was able to create this body of work that really allowed me to work through things, and led to some collaborations with creating public resources and a zine that we were able to give out to our communities through these dialogue sessions that we held. And I was also able to come to terms with sort of some models in grieving. This one is particularly useful because it orients us towards everyday life. Sometimes we're loss oriented, where we feel the grief very head on, and other days we're living life, right? We're going out with friends, we're doing the work we need to do. And a colleague and I took this to our communities in Maine. And why? Well, the reason is because we see headlines like this: apples baking on branches, wildfires that we're seeing, for instance, in LA now, people getting third-degree burns from pavements, all the reasons that we probably all have heard. We know that there are mental health impacts. We know that there are gradual impacts, including things such as sense of loss or autonomy and identity. And we know that the APA now recognizes eco-distress as something that needs to be worked out, that it's not something that is unique to me or to any one of us. And so I really consider this a natural response to an unnatural phenomena. And one of the organizations I came across was the Good Grief Network. Highly recommend them if anyone is interested in a peer-to-peer support network. They have a really wonderful network of people and a great program. I trained to be a facilitator with them, and I will just say it's a really wonderful group of people. And that led me to sort of, I'm always trying to get at how can I get at this vital experience, right? Both existentially, really it's an existential crisis. And so I'm working with salt the last few years. These are salted paper photographs focused on the loss aspect. But then at the same time that I'm making these, I'm really working towards thinking about healing and resilience, and how do we do that? How do I include that? Because that is a part of my conversation. And so that is what the exhibition focuses on, is this idea of building, rebuilding. And salt is a really great metaphor for that, because it creates these beautiful structures, right? It's very resilient. It's something that we need in our lives. And I think about it as this dichotomy. We need it to survive, but too much will kill us, right? It's this really amazing there are thousands and thousands of compounds that we know as salt, right, that scientifically qualify as salt. And they each have their own identity in terms of creating structure and whatnot. So this has allowed me to get the work to get to both sides, or sort of encompass the larger picture of both. Yes, we can be mourning and grieving, but we can also be working towards healing and building. And I just want to say I'm really a huge fan of the Native Plant Trust and Garden in the Woods, and I'm really excited that you're here. And if anybody has any questions, and we don't get to them today, please feel free to reach out to me, my emails and websites, and just say thank you very much for letting me be here tonight.
Let me just say that I'm also really excited to be here. Thank you to Catherine and Giffen for making this opportunity a possibility. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about a relatively minor slice of the larger climate change problem, which is in our world horticulture and landscapes and the choices that we make. And I want to say, I'm starting off my talk with a picture of a moldy sneaker. But I think it's also a great visual because it represents literally the footprint that we have left on the planet. But it's also there's some hopeful pieces in it too. Cool, we're zipping through this a lot faster than I'm not sure what's happening. So playing backs up. Okay, so the moss and lichen that is reclaiming this the sneaker to me is a visual that represents the resiliency of nature. That despite the abuses that we heap upon it, it keeps coming back and will likely be here long after humans disappear, if that's the place. The grasses around it are a introduced ecologically harmful grass, so that's another sign of human imprints and how we have changed things. And this is a little bit of a rhetorical question, but I don't believe there are any wild places left that have not been directly or indirectly touched by our influences. And yet, plants that have evolved into place continue to persist, and that is represented by the small green leaves underneath the sole, which is a really wonderful little plant called Michella. But so I don't want to dwell on a lot of bad news, but there are some sobering realities here that we face. Since the arrival of Europeans to this continent, we have altered a vast degree of land, equal to all of our national and state parks combined. We have covered 63,000 square miles of this country in lawn, which we're really trying to find. Lawn is one of these things that is useful, but also very resource intensive. And our choices in landscapes have led to the introduction of all of these ecological non-native plants that are problems. You might think of them as invasive plants. Most of them, I'd say 90% introduced by the ornamental horticulture industry at some point. So gardening, landscaping has a lot to do with why our landscapes look the way they do today and a lot of the challenges that we face. And there's kind of ripple effect that the presence of these things have on natural communities. Next, please. So ecological horticulture, which is something that Native Plant Trust really champions, is again, it's a positive response to this very unnatural phenomenon. And thank you, DM, for that wonderful phrase. People feel a lot of anxiety about what's happening. They don't know what the future brings. Our seasons continue to be inconsistent. Last year we had prolonged periods of drought. The year before that was one of the wettest on records. And it's hard to see how that affects the loss and abundance of all of the things that rely on plants. And so the use of native plants in landscapes is really a very forward-thinking and a very courageous act, because you're valuing the support that it offers for what remains. And I want to make sure that is very loud and clear as a message that this is a very positive, hopeful act. And that oftentimes when we consider the enormity and the complexity of climate change, and we can agree that two things can be true at once, that There are individual choices that you can make that are positive, as well as the need for society-wide changes in the way that we approach consumerism and our consumption, and whether our planet can carry that degree and rate. And I believe that Dr. Singh will be talking a little bit about this too. I want to take a minute also to talk about maybe a challenge to biodiversity and the way it gets used. When we think of biodiversity as a sum of the number of different things in a given place, but it says nothing about the abundance of any one of those. And we oftentimes use it as justification to destroy one place as long as we have an equal number of things somewhere else. And so there's this idea of bioabundance. And what this really is a call to introduce as many plants as you can as possible. If you have the space to do it, don't just plant 10, plant 50. Grow your own so you can plant hundreds. And the idea here is that the more abundant and support that we provide, the greater chance that those individuals will be able to adapt and change in a very uncertain climate. So one of the sort of starting assumptions of this approach has to do with genetic diversity, and it has to do with plants that or that we know where they're from. In other words, there are the landscapes of New England have adapted here and have supported and co-evolved with all of the life and the relationships that they sustain. And there's something really valuable about that. Many people don't know that most of the plants you get at the garden store and regular garden centers are grown as clones or cuttings, or are less, they inherently have less of an ability to be able to adapt and change. Making sure, and I think about the words of Lady Bird Johnson, who said that I want to make sure that Texas looks like Texas and Vermont looks like Vermont. You know, instate your state here, but preserving regional character and the things that make New England special and unique from other parts of the country starts with preserving and promoting the use of the plants that evolved here. Now, with climate change, of course, there are questions of how do those assemblages shift and change. And I am not somebody who says, well, climate models say that Massachusetts is going to feel like Virginia in 50 years. So let's start planting trees from down there up here now to get ahead of it. I think we need to value what we have here and give it a chance to adapt and change. But within that message is also an acknowledgement that there are going to be winners and losers. And we're already seeing things that were much more common in the past, really beautiful things like native orchids and trilliums and lilies that deer love to eat, becoming less and less common. And the other idea that gardens are connected. They don't exist in a bubble anymore. And this is one of the other bigger shifts, is that we're not really doing it for us anymore. It's not just about aesthetics. It's also about supporting as much wildlife as possible. The picture you see here is maybe not the most exciting plant. It's skunk cabbage. But what I find absolutely delightful about it is that no two flowers are ever the same. And there's something really wonderful about the individuality of plants. And sometimes we think of them as uniform and the same, and you can plant 100 of them and they're all the same. They're actually just as individual as we are, particularly if you value them for their non-uniformity and their character. And within that is a great deal of resilience. But what this is also about at its core is making sure that we maintain the relationships that those plants support. And the pollinator here is a great example. We love to grow all your own vegetables in the summertime. And if you don't have enough pollinators that are being attracted by the native plants, they're not going to come to your tomatoes and your blueberries and other things. So there is a direct connection between the health of those relationships and the food that comes to your plate. So some of these relationships are very specific. So this plant is the sole host for this really beautiful butterfly, the Baltimore checker spot. So if you want to have those in your garden, you have to give the caterpillars the food that it needs. It's not going to be able to eat anything else other than that particular plant. These relationships continue to, this is a really wonderful story, and I have non-traditional, perhaps ugly pollinators up here, because there's not just bees and butterflies and pretty things, but spiders and cicada killers and wasps and big flies that also do this in service. And what they're doing is doing the plant's bidding and making sure it makes seeds. And the seeds turn into these really fluffy things. And in the spring, goldfinches use it to make nests and raise their chicks. And it's just this really wonderful web of relationships. And that's really at the core of what this approach is all about, is making sure that we provide the scaffolding and the framework for all of those relationships to continue. So that's another one of my old favorite ones here that doesn't show up that great over here, but it's the Atlantic Flyway, just to show you how many birds come through this region, and many of them stop in here and need resources. Another fact for you, that 96% of all of our songbirds need insects in the spring to be reproductively successful, and no other groups of plants will provide the volume of insects than native plants do. So where your choices really matter. The more species rich you can make your garden, that's a form of pollinator conservation, and all those resources are then passed up along the line to the mammals, the birds, the raccoons, and your top predators, in this case, the raptor that's eating a squirrel. And using this is really maintaining the genetic diversity that we have here. That really sits at the core of this. Things that you can do is aim for about 70% or 2/3 of your yard. And I would say that this is really something for those that are privileged enough to own property and be able to have a garden. And if you don't, it doesn't mean that you can't be involved in some way, that you can't join clubs and advocate for better green spaces and public spaces. Community gardens are really wonderful ways to get involved. But you can see there's a lot of really simple things that you can do here to support biodiversity in your yard. And the idea, again, is that you have agency over this one particular place. And this sort of adage of plant it and they will come is really true. And you put these things into your yard, and then you begin to see new things, and you begin to deepen that relationship that you have with nature and with plants at the base of it. So your choices really do matter, and all conservation starts locally. Any questions, please, beyond tonight, get in touch. Thank you.
All right, so a big thank you to Catherine and the Danforth and my wonderful fellow panelists. I'm so honored to be here, and of course, to all of you for coming here today for this really, really important conversation. And I see some familiar faces here. I know there are people who are deeply involved in this work, so I'm looking forward to our conversation. All right, so I'm going to start by giving us some bad news, which I think some people will be familiar with and others maybe not, that it's not just climate change. So next slide, please. So what you see in front of you, and I hope everyone can see this clearly, is a very interesting diagram. This is research from about 2009 from Stockholm University that has gained traction. How many people in the room have heard of this concept of planetary boundaries? Anyone? Okay, some of you. All right, so what this means is that human activity is not without limit. In other words, we human beings can't do whatever the hell we want on this planet. We are bounded by natural limits, tolerances, and so on, but through natural cycles. And 9 of these natural cycles have been identified, these natural processes. And what they do is they define a space, a limit, within which human activity and the biosphere can flourish, but beyond which we are in a state where the biosphere and human well-being are in peril. Okay, and so what this means is that, well, firstly, tell this to mainstream economists. It's externalities for them, okay, all of this stuff we care about. But in any case, what this means is there are limits, and violating even one planetary boundary takes us away from this so-called safe space for humanity and the biosphere to thrive into dangerous territory and imperils life on Earth and human civilization. We have, as of 2023, violated 6 of these planetary boundaries. You can see in the diagram, sorry it's not any larger, but you can see that climate change is only one of them. There are others, and I'll just point out 2 really quickly. One is biodiversity loss, and Uli referred to some of that in his talk. The fact that we are in the middle of the Earth's 6th mass extinction of species. And the other that I'm going to point to is what they call novel entities, which refers to chemical pollution, particularly plastic pollution. All right. So we have already crossed environmental tolerances and limits for those, and climate change, of course, as well. And so what we have, if you combine that with the fact that we have apparently unending war and conflict, as well as social inequality everywhere, social crises everywhere, we have what is called a polycrisis, a bunch of interrelated complexes of crisis, okay, where climate change has a very important role as a threat multiplier, as an exacerbator of other crises. You might think of it as an accelerant on a house already on fire. So it's really important to have this big picture but we will zoom down to the local in a moment. So we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So first point here, go ahead, click on that. Yeah, so the question is, if it's not just climate change, what is it that we need to do, and what should a good solution to the problem do? Well, first of all, we need to reduce carbon emissions so that the carbon cycle is back in balance at a safe level. And that means switching all our systems to renewable energy, protecting ecosystems which act as carbon sinks, and very crucially, moving economics from this rhetoric of endless growth to true sustainability. Okay. And so the next point here is also to bring other planetary boundaries back into the safe space. So if you have a solution that reduces carbon emissions, but continues to destroy biosphere integrity, then that's not a real solution. So at the very least, your solution shouldn't endanger other planetary boundaries. That also means decreasing pollution levels to within environmental tolerances. So next, please. And one other really important thing the solution should do is to ensure equity and justice, because climate change and the polycrisis don't affect all of us equally, nor are all of us equally responsible for the problem. So it's essentially and centrally a problem of justice. It's also true in practical terms that if everybody is not in a safe place, then none of us is going to be in a safe place. Now, let's say that, for instance, let's say that you don't care about other people. Now, I'm sure that's not true of anyone in this room, but just for the sake of argument, that you only care about your little spot, and as long as that's okay, it's okay. Well, just as global climate systems are inherently interrelated, so are social systems, and they both interact with each other. So imagine in the global south, if the global south becomes unlivable, if the regions around the equator become unlivable, we're going to see mass migrations of people. We're not going to have the infrastructure to take care of everyone, assuming, of course, that they are not turned back with gunfire at the border, all right, which is something that we really have to worry about as of this week. So in terms of immigration and migrants, people are already worked up about it, but we haven't seen anything yet. So we have to pay attention to equity and justice, if nothing else for practical reasons, but hopefully all of us share that this is truly a matter of taking care of each other, because that is the right thing to do. So next slide, please. Of course, this is very daunting, because you can see immediately that there are many kinds of change that are needed and many scales of change that are needed. And in addition, we need scales, all the different time scales, short-term, medium-term, long-term change. We need to shift the economic system, the energy infrastructure, the transportation, shift in values, political and legal changes. And ultimately, what is at the core of all this is our relationship with the rest of nature. Because we are part of nature, we are not away from or separate from nature. So that is at the core of what is driving our crisis, that way of thinking that we are separate. And so we have to renegotiate and rejoin and re-inhabit our place in nature. And those are all very important and daunting changes. However, there's a bit of a complication. And so if you can have the next slide, please, that if we go to the first point on this, so if you would click for me, thank you. There are solutions everywhere, but most of the ones that are proposed are very much carbon-centric, ignoring other planetary boundaries, but they're also very technocratic. We do need technological change, but that's not the only thing that's going to shift. If that was the only thing we changed, it would not solve the problem. So there are a lot of technocratic solutions out there. And then there's also a lot of greenwashing. So please, everyone, be aware of this if you're not already. Governments and corporations are lying through their teeth. And sometimes, trying to cover up their actions through these kind of Band-Aid things. The most amazing thing I heard, and I have to share this with you, this was from the CEO of Royal Dutch Shell, who was in a conference. And he says, well, you know what? We are making vegan food available on our oil rigs. So it was like, all right, well, that's really interesting. But what about all that oil? So all right, on to the next point. And there are fortunately people keeping track of this, like this really interesting site, Climate False Solutions. All right, so why is it that there's all this stuff, all these complications and all this lying and all that? That's because somebody is benefiting from the current system. So we have to acknowledge that the powerful have a lot to lose, all right? The powerful have a lot to lose. So climate action and action for the earth and action for the environment and action for everything we love and cherish always must acknowledge that we need to resist power. And if we don't do that, then we are not necessarily going to be as effective as we could be. And so thanks to my friend Michelle, who is here in the audience, who's a glass artist, and she kindly drew a sketch for me to represent economic inequality. And you can see the people at the top in their palaces and everybody else and nature at the bottom. So next slide, please. So I'm going to point out one quick thing. Oh, did we skip a slide or can we go back one step? Okay, all right, maybe that comes later. Okay, so I want to point out that this is not something that we can do. We cannot face this kind of crisis alone. Okay, so many of my students tell me, well, this is so big, I'm just one person, what can I do? And I'm going to come back to that point. But in order to find our way through the forest of solutions and so on and so forth, we need some kind of a critical framework that also helps our imaginations to construct a good solution. So on to the next slide. What we've tried to come up with in the classroom, and this is something I've experimented with, is that when we are presented with a solution, for example, let's say that we need to change from gasoline-powered vehicles to electric vehicles. Now we know we need to do that. We really do need to do that. But suppose the solution is phrased like this, that we need to do a switcheroo. We just need to switch from gasoline-powered vehicles to electric vehicles, okay? So that's how it's stated. Well, then we ask ourselves, based on our knowledge of the polycrisis and climate change, so if you'd go ahead, well, does the solution move us towards decreasing carbon emissions? And then we examine it and we say, well, kind of depends on how it's manufactured and so on. But during the life of an electric vehicle, sure, we decrease carbon emissions. So this is like partially passes the first question. It depends also on whether you're charging from green energy sources or from fossil fuels. So there's all those little details that can now come in when you pose this question. And then we go on to the next question, which is, what about other planetary boundaries? Is it, if it's not restoring them, is it at least not violating other planetary boundaries? Well, one of the things we know is that if demand for electric vehicles grows as is expected, then so is mining. And the UN is talking about now allowing mining in the deep sea. So, which is an extremely ecologically sensitive environment. So, and also mining for cobalt and nickel and lithium for car batteries in the Congo, for instance, displacing indigenous people, but also destroying carbon sinks. Well, question mark there, right? So, okay, maybe not so much on two. So promoting social equity and justice. Well, not if you displace indigenous peoples from their territories. But also, what about the pricing of these cars? Like, my students, many of them have to work to pay for college, and they say, we can't afford an electric vehicle. So where's the equity and justice here? All right, so maybe not so much there. So we go on to the fourth question, and this is important when we study complex systems, that does the solution, is it actually something that can have a large scale impact? Does it have a real impact? Okay. So there are solutions that might sound, that would be good as part of something larger, perhaps like, making a town bicycle friendly. And that's great, but is it going to really have a large term impact on everything that we are talking about? Probably not. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but you shouldn't delude yourself that that's what it's going to do. So in other words, so one way to think about it is, do EVs link up with other solutions? Like if we electrify everything, what does that do? Could EVs be part of that? And so on. So there's some discussion there. And then the fifth question is that what are the values and the frameworks from which the solution is emerging? Are these the same values and frameworks that have given rise to the problem? Or are these values and frameworks that are based on interdependence, reciprocity, responsibility, and sufficiency? And by the way, these we draw also from indigenous knowledge systems, which I've found absolutely essential as part of thinking about climate change in a holistic way. So if you talk about the electric vehicle as simply doing a switcheroo with gasoline vehicles, then that's not changing the system, right? That's not changing the system. That's just changing, that's a Band-Aid solution. So it's after we go through these questions and we say the solution as stated does not pass this test. Then we ask one important question. So if you'd click for me one more time, that if it doesn't pass the test, is there something, what needs to be changed to make it a real solution? Okay, and then we talk about, okay, we have to make sure that demand doesn't rise exponentially because we have a finite planet and we can't have exponential destruction of resources. And so you have to level off demand at some point, which means we have to go to things like public transport, to a sharing economy and things like that, right? And then we have to ensure also that equity and justice and all of the things are met. So I won't go into the details, but we have a long discussion about how that solution can actually pass this 5-question test, which is only a kind of preliminary. But what this makes us do is to think in a more critical and ethical way about the solution instead of simply accepting it at face value. And then ultimately it helps us, along with an exercise that I wish I had time to talk about, which is called speculative futurism, which is really interesting as well. But along with that, we then start thinking about solutions that are kind of, complexly connected to each other. All right, so next slide, please. Okay, so I want to come back to the point that we can't do this work alone. It's too overwhelming. It's not possible to do it as an individual. And the work that must be done is, in fact, both individual and collective. To go back to a point that Uli made, that we need to do things in our backyards, but we also need to viralize those things and make them collective. All right, so, if you rewild your backyard, maybe convince your neighbors to do so. And maybe we can help construct, and there's actually a project on this where you construct a continent-long kind of pathway for migratory creatures, yard to yard, city to city, town to town. So we want to think big, even when we're thinking local. But this is one of my favorite pictures of a community in India that I'm very familiar with. This group of women in one of the most poverty-stricken regions in India, actually over 20 years protected and regenerated their local forest. They're amazing people. They're among the poorest of the poor, but they have so much ebullience. They have richness in every other sense of the word. Okay, so and so I'm in touch with this community. I tell their story to my class, and they're doing amazing things. And they're doing it. And the reason why they have so much enthusiasm and positivity despite their suffering is because they're doing it together. And together, when I say together, it means together with the forest as well. Because as they say, we are doing it for the animals and plants and the people. So this is really, really important, to not do the work alone. So one of the things, so next slide, please. that has emerged from experiments like this. So this is again local to global or local to at least subcontinental in India, is that in India there's an ambitious project to link all these little local attempts for people to regain environmental sustainability, food sovereignty, water sovereignty, lift themselves out of poverty. All of these attempts that are local, there's now an attempt to link them up and make a network so that they can not only help each other, but also have a larger political voice and a larger kind of a stronger resistance to power structures and to destructive so-called development. And so out of that conversation among these different movements has emerged this beautiful thing, which is called the flower of transformation. And not all the, since it's not too very well visible, I encourage you to just Google this term, to just search on this term, the flower of transformation. And they've come up with 5 principles that local communities can embrace in order to start transforming. But it's not just about transforming our backyards and transforming our energy sources, it's about transforming ourselves as well. So next slide, please. So one of the things I do in the classroom when we say, well, okay, I'm just one person, what can I do? Is I encourage students to to think of themselves not as one person, but as multiple people. So click through, please. So we start with me. And as we continue to click through, this should come up. That's weird. Okay. I think the circles aren't showing up. This is actually something that has, it's showing up clearer over there. Okay. Okay. My apologies to everybody on this side. But what we do is we make a network of connections. So I'm connected to my town, I'm connected to my school, my place of work, I'm connected to affinity and affinity groups through my hobbies and interests. But I'm also connected to the planet through, well, both directly and indirectly. So town to state to nation to planet, but also I'm connected to climate movements. So one of the things we can do immediately, which can help with both personal transformation and transforming the world, is to join a climate movement or any kind of environmental movement that's doing good work. And the 2 that I know of, for example, are 350.org, which is international, national, and state and local. There's 350 MA. And also there's the Sunrise Movement, which is a youth movement in the United States doing wonderful work, including advocating for a Green New Deal and an economic and technological transformation in the United States. So everything is much harder now as of the beginning of this week, but we have to be even more determined than we were before, and even more creative and imaginative, and even more loving of everything that we love in order to be sure that we prevail. So I'm going to end with the last, I think the next slide is the last slide. So if you'd go on to that. Yeah, once we click through all these, then, all right, and that's it. Thank you. And look forward to the conversation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kaela Keyes. I'm here on behalf of the Surfrider Foundation, who I volunteer with. And yeah, thank you so much, Catherine, for inviting our organization to be a part of tonight's event and leading the charge on this along with Gibbon. I'm so grateful that we have folks in our community who are so passionate about gathering other like-minded folks or people who are interested in getting involved and learning more and figure out how to make a difference in this regard. So yeah, and so excited to be a part of the speakers this evening. I'm gonna see if this works. We'll probably use, oh, great, it did. Okay. Yeah, so my name is Kaela. Just a little bit about me before I speak further on Surfrider. So I've been in Massachusetts the past 12 years, Boston specifically, but I've been going to the Cape my whole life. And I just moved out there full time as of October.
You do not need to be a surfer to be involved in Surf Rider, but I did just start to learn how to surf a couple of years ago. I was in Costa Rica for my first solo trip post-pandemic as well. I went to Costa Rica for a month, worked remote down there, and I took a bunch of lessons and just fell in love with it. So I've always loved the water, growing up going to the Cape, but it's definitely another activity that brings me closer to the ocean, and why I'm passionate about saving our environment. I also had the opportunity to surf the world's longest left wave. I took a surf trip after I learned how to surf in Costa Rica. I was all in on it. My sister told me about this group called Surf with Amigas. And I booked a trip basically right after getting home from that, which was in Chicama, Peru for a week, and met a group of wonderful ladies. Just a cool fact about me. As Catherine said, I'm an ex-advertising professional. I was working at ad agencies, for about 10 years before I decided about a year and a half ago to embark on a creative sabbatical. So since then, I've been doing more traveling and working at Patagonia right now as a seasonal employee, and just doing more things that are important to me, and furthering my education. And lastly, I'm energized by building connections within the Surfrider community and beyond that. So, okay. Well, for some folks, you might not be able to read it, but this slide does say at the top, we need the ocean. We would not be here without it. And I'm going to talk about our organization, which is Surfrider. We're dedicated to the protection and enjoyment of our world's waves, beaches, and oceans. We've been around since 1984. Started by a group of enthusiastic surfers in California, but as I mentioned, you do not need to be a surfer to get involved. We're a network of grassroots activists, so I'm a volunteer. I do not work for Surfrider. They do have employees, but it's really, helping us to organize and helping us get the resources that we need to build our own chapters. So I'm on the Massachusetts chapter as a volunteer coordinator, and there's many ways to get involved, which I'll talk about further. So these red dots are our different chapters or clubs. We recently started a Cape and Islands specific chapter. Last year, I had the opportunity to lead our first beach cleanup on Nantucket, which was awesome. And I'm not going to focus on this, but yes, we've already, along with my co-presenters this evening, established that we do have challenges that we're up against in regards to our planet's safety and well-being, our environments. You can see from these visuals, the trash in the ocean and the plastic, but one of the key questions we're going to discuss tonight is how we can best make progress on big, complex problems as an organization of volunteers. You heard this already from my presenters, so I'm just going to say it is one of our themes of the evening, to think globally, but really act locally. So back to the images from a couple of slides ago, yes, it may be, a bummer to see that, and you might think doom and gloom. So this child here is meant to represent the feeling that we feel when we see trash on our beaches or litter. This is a picture of a child from our tentpole event every year called Stokey. It is a play on words, surfing to offer kids environmental education. But then on this slide, we see, okay, when you have a friend or a like-minded person, someone going through the challenge with you, they're in the trenches, you get some support, some guidance from maybe surf riders, Massachusetts chapter executive committee, you come to a meeting, you start to realize that there are some structures in place to help you go about this, and it's not all doom and gloom, and you do have the opportunity to make an impact, to finally realizing we can actually have some fun going about these challenges. And also, we're still here to enjoy our planet, and we might as well make some friends along the way and have a good time. So that's just a little story. But I'm actually going to have us get a little bit more engaged with one another, and we're going to play a game. So I will explain it now. What we're going to do in a moment, after I've gone over it, is everyone will get up from their seats, and we're going to split into 4 groups. So everyone can pick, we'll just do the 4 corners of the room. And basically what we're going to do is everyone will chat in your individual group and decide on a gesture that you'll make. Respectful gesture, but fun, silly. And then after about a minute of, deliberating amongst your group, I'll reconvene us, and on the count of 3, everyone will perform their gesture. So everyone at the same time from the different groups will do it. You'll look around, notice what everyone else is doing. Then we're going to repeat go back into your individual groups, decide a different gesture, or it doesn't have to be different necessarily. The goal is to eventually have all groups, everyone in the room, perform the same gesture. So keep that in mind. Cool. Okay. Well, thank you all for your participation in that game. And wow, can I just say that the last time I did this, when I co-presented with one of my surf rider teammates in April of last year, we did not get to a consensus. We did 4 or 5 rounds, and it was a bit bigger than this. We were at UMass Boston's first New England Youth Ocean Summit, but we did not get that. So I'm really shocked. But to the discussion, if anyone, you can just raise your hand. How did you decide in your group what you were going to pick? Or the surfing? Because it's surfing related. Okay. Yeah. Anyone else? Because the first round was, everyone picked. There was only 2 rounds. Did you notice any differences or similarities between how your individual group versus the whole group made decisions? Again, the discussion is a little bit different since it didn't take us it only took us 1 round for everyone to do it. In the spring, we saw almost like a power struggle between 2 groups who of the four who like didn't want to give in to like doing another group's sign. Like they were like, I think they did like, I don't know, the air guns or something. So that was interesting. But did anyone else have any observations they wanted to share? Okay. It was easy. It was fast and easy. Everyone can do it. Yeah, all you needed was to move your hand. You didn't need to contort. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah. Oh yes, I know. Were you in the back corner? Oh, you were in that corner. Yeah, associated with that. Yeah. Wait, which group did that? Okay, you thought about it. Thank you, because I was like, wait, I didn't see that. I saw like the dab or something. Yeah. Yes. Okay. But no one did it. You saying you thought about it, but you didn't do it. Okay. Gotcha. That's really interesting. Yeah. Yeah, meaning. I think that answers the third question. Like, what factors do you think made a difference? Not even what gesture made the majority, but what gesture was not chosen, thought about, but decided to shift away from. Okay, cool. So one of the other questions I had was, what do you think got in the way of forming a consensus? But we didn't have anything getting in the way again. So I'm a little tripped up. But anyways, so I'll just move on to the key lessons from this exercise. So the most important factor in whether someone does a behavior is what percentage of the people around them do that behavior. So again, I mentioned in the last spring when I did this with a bunch of college students and some adults in the community as well, there was like a power struggle. Some folks around them didn't want to give in, but yeah, eventually after a few rounds, when you see 3 out of the 4 groups choosing to do a particular symbol and the ultimate goal is for everyone to do the same signal, eventually, well, actually, yeah, they didn't make it to consensus, but the other groups started to join in on what gesture was making the consensus. Anyways, all of that being said, this just goes to demonstrate it's a behavior change simulation game that you don't need to be a massive influencer to promote behavior change. You don't need to be a Taylor Swift or a Beyonce or a Kardashian, as some may think that those are the only people that start off. It's actually folks at the edges of a network that are shown in the circles, the red circles, these pockets of folks that start behavior change that ultimately impacts the wider group. Cool. I'm gonna fly through the rest of this because I'm pretty much out of time and I want to be able to have more Q&A as Catherine has scheduled for us, but a little bit more about us. Yeah, we're all local and Surfriders. So you can see our coastline here. Yeah, as I mentioned, the theme, we're not alone in doing this work. There's a lot of work to be done, but there's also power in a collective. You're not just one person, and joining an advocacy group such as Surfrider doesn't have to be, but yeah, whatever you choose to get involved in, there's power in numbers. Every skill set matters. Don't think that you are, not useful. You might not know even that you have a certain talent or interest or something that is unique, or it doesn't even have to be unique. Just the fact that you want to offer up your time and energy is wonderful. So you can just see in this picture, we have someone, the person in the blue shirt, person is donating their time to be a Surfrider representative at an event. We have, sorry, you can't really see everything again, but I think you'll all get the presentation afterwards. There's, there's a graph in the upper right-hand corner. So someone needs to be data-oriented and be able to produce that graph. There's some art shown in the bottom right corner. So, being more creative-minded, so that's the point of that slide. Yes, I thought I recognized you. I'm so excited to meet afterwards. So this is really cool because we actually have Rebecca here in the room. This is just a specific example of how you can be an artist activist. So Rebecca actually collected, along with a group of students, all these discarded nip bottles on beaches, and she organized the creation of a massive sculpture monster, that then they paraded around on like the Earth Day or not in New Bedford. Yeah, so she's here to talk about it if you want to chat with her in the yellow afterwards. But that demonstrates the impact of litter. Just flipping through this really quickly so you can see the visual. Excuse me. This shows our plastic bag laws in Massachusetts. And starting in 1990, it was like one section, which was Nantucket, and then to 2023, you can see by how many pockets have updated their laws. 158 local laws have been passed. Greater than 1 billion fewer plastic bags per year have been used. So that's just monumental impact. To start a change, you only need 10 valid signatures in your local community. So if you want to start a petition, I'm not the expert on that. My colleague Alex Bai is. He works on the campaigns element of Surfrider, but that all goes to show you don't need 100 people to start something. You can actually start it really quickly. Just by getting a few people involved with you. And we want you involved. It starts with you as the individual and rallying to local and then state and country and world, but you have to start somewhere. And it's really nice to be in community with other people who care about our planet. So feel free to chat with me if you want to learn more or anything. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate you spending your evening here with us.
Thank you so much to our panel. We're going to take some questions and answers in a little bit. But before we do, at your seats, and shortly on the Zoom screen as well, we have shared with you an activity sheet that, if you'd like to engage with people who are currently here to look at together, but we do have wonderful refreshments and other advocacy groups that have set up down in the museum. But this activity sheet actually was born out of the rehearsal that we had with the panel, where we talked about what are the group of things that we all should think about personally when we'd like to motivate ourselves and consider how to work towards solving some of the crisis that we are experiencing with our climate. And so there's a Venn diagram that is not very clear on the slide, but on the forms that you all have, it's made up of a circle devoted to values. So when you think about values, reflect on what's important to you. How do you want to live and work in our world? What concerns you or motivates you to act? Think about your skill sets. It's something that Kaela brought up during her presentation as well. Think about your education, your past experiences, your past educational experiences. What are you good at? What would you like to share about yourself? And then thirdly, networks. I myself started this whole program by reaching out to a network of people. And think about yourself. Who are the people that you know? Who would you like to invite to join you in what interests you and what efforts you'd like to make? So this is just a diagram to kind of consider and help guide you. In addition to that, we invited a number of advocacy organizations who have their information tables down in the museum. They're listed on that additional packet where you've been seated. And they will be happy to kind of describe the things that they are currently working on, and certainly wish to invite you to participate if you find that their missions are aligning with what your interests are as well. Finally, before we get to the questions, we'll go to the next slide, please. We would love to get your feedback for this evening. There's a QR code on the screen, which you can capture with your camera, and it will connect you to our survey form. So otherwise, thank you for this evening for being here. Giffen is going to moderate the question and answer period. Please feel free to, raise your hand, and she'll come around with a microphone so that you can share your questions, and then we'll have our panelists address those questions for you.
Thank you for this. It was a great night. Even the game. So the think globally, act locally, a lot of acting locally. I've been to a lot of climate things. I've participate in a lot of these things. And one of the things I noticed that climate people, activists or whatever, are reluctant, or they do not want to go near, is animal agriculture. They do not want to talk about the impact of the way the food comes to our plate on climate change. I remember Naomi Klein, when she was at FSU, kind of rebuffed a question that came to her about that. So the most local place that we have is the plate that's right in front of us. And the UN had said that a plant-based diet would be huge steps in going towards helping with climate change. And also, I think cutting across several of those the planetary borders, that kind of stuff, because it's like habitat. And so I guess my question is, and I don't want to be confrontational about this, but are any of you vegan? And if you're not, why not?
Yeah. We've gotten some feedback that folks in the Zoom room are having trouble hearing questions. So I just want to sort of repeat the gist of that question. So as I understand it, so you're asking our panelists, why are you vegan? And if not, why? And essentially the place of responses to animal agriculture in the climate movement more generally. So I hope that's a little bit more audible to folks on Zoom.
Thank you for your question. No, I am not vegan. I do try to eat my produce as locally as possible. I belong to a really wonderful small farm called Stearns Farm right down the road here. And I am privileged enough to have a yard big enough where I can grow a lot of my own vegetables. And then we do try to source meat when we do eat it locally from pasture raised, happy meat, if you'd like.
There is no such thing.
Well,
There isn't. I'm sorry. It's still murder.
sure.
That's another conversation.
No,
that I'd be happy
absolutely,
to have
absolutely. And I was
some
going to say
place.
respectfully, I don't want to go down that
no,
route.
no. And neither do I.
I keep chickens and enjoy fresh eggs. So, I mean, I do my part, but I'm also not lost on the fact that like keeping chickens means I have to drive my car to get feed and other sorts of things, to the point that these are great steps that I can take, but they're still wrapped into larger patterns and behaviors that are not beneficial for the climate.
Yeah. I think that one thing that people don't really know is that, I mean, the most recent number that I read is that 85% or something like that of the crops grown on the planet go to feed livestock. So that's a lot of monoculture in places that, so. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to add to it and say that you're right that food production and industrial agriculture are huge contributors to climate change, to biodiversity loss, to land system change, which are at least 3 of the planetary boundaries, but also freshwater use. And the thing is that this is not to absolve people who, like us. I'm mostly just to talk about myself briefly first, I'm mostly vegetarian, like I'm almost vegan in a sense, but what really limits me is health issues that where I have very little tolerance for some foods. Like I could live on arugula, but I can't digest it.
Yeah.
Okay. But looking at the wider picture, my sense is that like most urban individuals in big cities should consider being vegan or at least vegetarian, and making sure, what the problem is, like factory farms. So basically factory farms are the major issue, and factory farms eat resources, including water. They help create new diseases, and they also are extremely cruel to animals. And so, which is, so on top of that, they contribute to climate change as well. So, I think changing food habits is very important, but it's extremely difficult to do unless the systems that produce those foods are confronted. And we have to think about how we can do that creatively and powerfully. Industrial agriculture, for instance, insists on massive fertilizer use. And that not only releases greenhouse gases, but it also has an impact on the environment when excess fertilizer runs off into the oceans and causes dead zones. And yet we know that from agroecology, for instance, is a whole new way of thinking, well, new and old way of thinking about how to grow plants. Which does not use genetic engineering and does not use amounts of synthetic fertilizer, which, by the way, is also a cause of one of the other planetary boundaries. The nitrogen cycle is way out of balance as well. So yes, centrally food, we're also looking at food as systems. And we won't necessarily need everybody necessarily to change to vegan or even vegetarian, as long as most of their food is plant-based and as long as we get rid of factory farms. They're indigenous people who have traditionally evolved to eat heavy amounts of meat, like native Alaskans, for instance. But they are doing that as part of the cycle of nature, as part of being part of the environment, not like us who are separated from everything that we consume, right? So excellent point, thank you.
It's also, especially with the factory farms, it's a social and equity issue as well, because most of those places are in poor areas, and people in those areas generally have poor health in relationship to their proximity to those places. So.
Thank you so much for the, this is not on. Thank you so much for that question. And I'm looking a little bit at time and realizing that we also have quite a few questions coming in from the online audience. So I wanted to share something that was a question that came in from the online audience for our panelists, which is the idea of when this panelist is, or this audience member is wondering for our panelists, when you feel hopeless or isolated in sort of the task of building a more resilient climate, responding to climate change, what do you do? And do you have any advice for those of us in this room about that?
Oh my gosh, what a great question. Sorry if I can get this out. Okay. Get off my phone, get off the internet, and take action. Coming here tonight is something that I do in a way to fight back from any feelings of hopelessness, or especially this week with, as you mentioned, Dr. Singh, I just do something by taking action. That is my step to fighting back and practicing my resiliency in the fight. You know, this is not something that any of us can do alone. It's probably not even going to be in our lifetimes. Like, if you burn out, then you're no use to us. So taking care of yourself also, make sure that you know, everyone's self-care is different, but like, I need to meditate a little bit, and, you know, take care of yourself first. Yes, we need to take care of each other, but like, you can't participate if you're just completely burned out, if you're overdoing it, or on the opposite end, if you're not doing anything because you're just busy doom scrolling. So that took me a few years, I feel like, to learn it. I've been volunteering with Surf Riders since the fall of 2021, when I was feeling pretty low during COVID years, pretty depressed. And I was like, I just need to do something. I need to get involved. I need to like make a difference. And yeah, every time that you come out to a meeting like this, like, you're taking action, or, you know, stepping away from tonight with a few organizations in mind, and actually like emailing someone, like doing something tangible, that is my resiliency and like resistance to, you know, the climate crisis. Long answer, but it's a great question.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll just add a quick thing that I think part of the action is like, if you're taking action with other people, but also if you're sharing grief with other people, that really makes a difference. We are not biologically evolved to deal with such a huge volume of grief on our own. We need to share with other people. We need to grieve what we've lost. And when we do that, and often the arts really help with that, the arts and the humanities help us through grieving, whether it's poetry writing or painting or something like that. And sometimes, you know, some people would critique that and say, oh, that's being self-indulgent. But actually it isn't. You need to care for yourself and each other before you are armed to act again. So, you know, one climate scientist talks about how, you know, using the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief, you know, which is the standard in psychology, that when you lose someone you love, you go through these typical 5 stages. And he and other scholars have added a 6th stage. So the stages include things like apathy, denial, anger, you know, bargaining, trying to tell yourself it's not going to be so bad, and then ultimately grieving, which frees you from it. And the 6th stage they add is rolling up your sleeves and getting to work. And it's when you go through, when you go through those stages, that it frees you up, you know, when you go through the grief instead of around it. And that frees you to act. I've experienced that personally. I've seen this in the classroom and in activist groups, really grieving together and acknowledging the emotional weight of the problem is so, so important, because then after that, your emotions let you be and you can act. So just my little...
Just quickly, I agree with dropping the screens and go outside. Learn to observe the rhythms of nature around you. I went for a walk today in the garden, which I am privileged to be able to walk around there. I do recognize that. And I was just delighted to see that foxes and coyotes are using our pathways, and they have footprints all over the snow. And there's just something really wonderful about that. And I can't wait for that first little poke of green. And it reminds me that nature is resilient and that we're coming up on this moment of rebirth. And there's something really, just really wonderful about that and reassuring.
Hi, thank you all. I'm glad to be here with like-minded folks, and I appreciated your presentations. I'm going to make a comment first, and then I have a question for you, Kaela. So the first comment is that I tell you this because it has bearing on something I want to share. I'm both a veterinarian and a public health professional, and I'm deeply involved on an international level, national, state, and local level with something called One Health, which is the interdependence of human, other animal, because we're animals, plant, and ecosystem or environmental health. It's the interdependence of the health and well-being of all of those domains. So if anybody's interested in that, I'd be more than happy to talk to you. There's a lot going on and all over the world. But in public health and also in veterinary medicine, something that's really important is prevention. So Kaela, getting back to your example of picking up nips, and something that, you know, we've done this in Uxbridge, Massachusetts as well. That's great, and it makes a statement, but the real issue is, how do you prevent people from dropping nips? How do you prevent them from buying them, stores from selling them? You know, the prevention, I think, is really more important, and it's much harder to get people to do something where there's no impact, or where you can't measure an impact because what you're hoping to accomplish doesn't happen. So that's my question.
Well, that would be a good problem to get to a point where the thing that you're trying to prevent doesn't happen. Right now, that's a great question. The pollution, the demonstration that Rebecca put together is helpful because it's visual, and everyone's different. I myself am very much a visual learner, and it's hard for some folks who aren't able to see the problem in front of them. When you see when you come to a beach cleanup that Surfrider hosts, and you see like bags and bags of trash, and before we bag it all up to weigh how much we've collected, we spread it all out and count the number of different items. So cigarette butts, plastic bottle caps, pieces of styrofoam greater than a quarter, smaller than a quarter. So yes, I totally agree. Like, that's helpful to just getting the awareness out there that there is a problem, but ideally we don't even want that at the beginning to have trash at the beginning. So to answer your question, what we're doing is data collection, which is super important. Yes, it is great to be able to have the visuals and see how much trash we removed, but to get to the point where we don't have it, which, to be quite honest, and I was reading something the other day, like, it's just not a realistic goal to have like all plastic removed from the ocean. There is so much, and the microparticles, like, goes to the bottom. So like, that's not even the goal because it's not attainable. But to your question, what we do is, once we've counted and tallied up all of that data on what types of trash we've collected. It gets submitted to our database, our headquarters database, and that data is very instrumental to the type of work that my colleague Alex does in regards to campaigns, because we can say, hey, we've collected X number of plastic-based pieces of trash. Like, this is a problem, and it's harder to ignore when there's evidence that supports the problem. But yeah, that's my answer to that.
Yeah, that's a great question and a great response from Kaela. And I want to just mention a couple of things. One is that I did hear about one campaign where some kids actually collected. I think it was, those chip packets, those little chip packets that were empty and contributing to plastic trash. And they collected huge amounts in boxes, and they sent it back to the company that manufactured it. And that got a lot of press. And one of the things that's important about it is to think that this should influence policy. Why aren't companies responsible for the trash they produce? Because it's very difficult as an individual, as you just stated, even as a group, to clean up in around a certain place. You have to really get at the system. And it used to be, and some of us who are old enough will remember, that there was a time when most things came in glass bottles, like drinks, for instance, and you could return your glass bottle and get 5 cents back or whatever, right? So who changed that system, and why? And why wasn't the public consulted about it, right? So we need to also push for policy change, and that's where the data can be very useful, exactly. And right. And so we have to remember that other worlds are possible. And thank you for mentioning One Health. That's really great. And in fact, the indigenous people have us beat on that, because if you look at the Swinomish tribe in northwestern Washington state, they have these 6 health indicators, and it's not just physical health of individuals, it's also mental health, but they're also counting moose in their woods as part of environmental health, and looking at how healthy the animals and the plants are, because we know it's all connected. So thank you for mentioning that. That's awesome.
I'm going to break in a little bit. We're really coming up fast on 7:30, and what I'd like to invite all of us to do is to take your questions that you do have, and let's all adjourn down to the museum where we have refreshments set up, as well as the various advocacy groups that are listed on that sheet that you've received. We will have all of our panelists downstairs as well, and thank you so much for being here this evening.